Delighted to join the Clergy Study Days program of the for the priests of the Archdiocese of San Francisco. And as I speak to you from the Vatican, please allow me to bring you best wishes, blessings, and prayers of His Holiness, our beloved Pope Francis. Congratulations for organizing this program and on Laudato Si. And allow me right at the beginning to thank very sincerely Father Ken Weir, a very close friend, a brother priest of mine, for this kind invitation. And I prepared a small presentation for you, which I would like to share with you. The title that I've given for my presentation is Laudato Si, an integral vision for action. So my talk will be about Laudato Si. The first part is on the unique contribution that this encyclical has made in offering us integral perspective on our common home and on the crisis of our common home. And the second part, I will try to speak on the importance of turning Laudato Si into action. Laudato Si, as we know, was published. It was signed by Pope Francis on 24th of May, 2015. And I was surprised, hardly a fortnight after the publication of Laudato Si, Dale Jamieson, who teaches at New York State University, wrote that this is the most important environmental text of the 21st century. Now, 5 years later, looking back, we think that was a prophecy that has come true. And what is unique about Laudato Si, I think, is its integral vision. That beautiful paragraph of the encyclical 66, easy to remember, 66, that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our Creator, with our neighbor, our brothers and sisters, and with the earth itself. Now, this is the integral vision of Laudato Si, and allow me to share 7 reflections on this. Why Laudato Si's vision is an integral vision. First of all, the subtitle of the encyclical is On Care for Our Common Home. And this is really a paradigm change. For many years, we spoke of the environment, but that was probably a superficial way of talking about Earth. Earth is not just an environment. Earth is our oikos, is the home that hosts us. And that's what Laudato Si does. In talking about Earth as our common home, Pope Francis ushers in a major paradigm shift. It is the crisis of our very common home. For many years, as we said, we were concerned about environmental issues, but we never really took it seriously because it is our home that is crumbling around us. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this beautiful image. This was taken by Apollo 8, the previous but one mission that landed on the moon. And in this mission, they were supposed to photograph the moon to prepare for the landing. So they had their camera, everything ready. And as they got ready to shoot the moon, there was such a beautiful surprise. They found the Earth rising. And so much so they called it the Earth Rise. And people tell us this is probably the most widely circulated photograph. I invite you to pause for a moment and in a way recapture the sentiments of those first astronauts, because they saw this blue-green jewel rising so gently on the horizon. And Earth is our common home. We don't see national frontiers or borders. It is one home in which we, along with the rest of God's creatures, live together. And that's the reason we think why God raised Pope Francis in this kairos, in this moment, because, he took the name of Saint Francis, and Saint Francis and San Francisco, you have, we envy you. You have this wonderful saintly patron, Saint Francis. And Saint Francis' conversion, as all of us know, began in around 1205, when, as a young man, he was disappointed, with life and delusioned. And one afternoon, he goes for a walk and walks into the church of San Damiano in the outskirts of Assisi. And he enters the chapel there, which is still there, as we know. And he looks at the crucified Lord, and the crucified Lord, speaks to him, not just once, but thrice, 3 times. So he was not daydreaming. And he heard these words very clearly. The Lord told him, Francis, go and repair my house, which, as you see, is falling into ruin. So Francis naturally thought it is the chapel, which was in a very bad conditions. It was in a dilapidated situation. So he began to repair this church, and some of his friends joined him. And that chapel was rebuilt. As I said, even today we can visit it. A few months ago, I was there. But Saint Bonaventure, in his biography of Saint Francis, he says, the life of Saint Francis entitled, he says, the house that the Lord wanted him to rebuild was not just the chapel of San Damiano. It was the house of God, the church. And today we know, thanks to the Franciscan movement, the gospel values that he discovered with such freshness of fraternity, of universal solidarity, of simplicity, of poverty, the church was renewed. And we know the vision that the Pope at that time had, this poor friar, literally supporting the church, so that the church could stand, And that's what Saint Francis did, He repaired the house of God of that time, that house. And 2013, 8 centuries later, another Francis comes onto the scene, into the world scene. He's elected as the Pope, and no one expected him. Literally, no one expected him. And we think this man was sent by God for the same mission. And this is one of the most beautiful slides I've ever come across. And it is in Italian. It says, Francesco va e ripara la nostra casa. Francis, go and repair our home. And this time, if you notice, there's a change. It is not, the Lord is not telling my house, but our house. And it's not just the Lord speaking. It's also the polar bear and the little bird and the indigenous chief. We had the Synod on the Amazon a few months ago, last year, around in October last year at the Vatican. And, given the precarious state of our common home, the Lord and all these people, the creatures are telling this Francis, go and repair our common home. And we think that providentially Pope Francis was raised by God, not just to rebuild the church, the house of God. Many people thought that, Pope Benedict could not manage, and here comes a strong man, and he's reforming the church, as we know. But we think the mission of Pope Francis is much wider. It is to rebuild our common home. And that's why Laudato Si, Pope Francis invites the churches, religions, and all people of goodwill. The encyclical, as we know, is addressed to all people of goodwill. And he invites us all to care for our fragile planetary home before it is too late. To quote him, I urgently appeal, so it's an urgency about it, for a new dialogue, something that we need to do together. So dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. So this is the first point, that Laudato Si is about Earth as our common home. A second element why Laudato Si's vision is integral, because it offers us a comprehensive, we might call, say, an integral perspective about the crisis of our common home. What Pope Francis tells refers to Laudato Si as the cry of the earth. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis offers a masterly synthesis of the manifold manifestations of the contemporary ecological crisis, the crisis of our very home: pollution, waste, climate change, depletion of natural resources, and especially water and biodiversity loss. And allow me to insist on this integral perspective, because sometimes there's a danger we might reduce Laudato Si to a climate encyclical or a, biodiversity. Laudato Si is much more. It offers a very masterly, comprehensive view of the crisis of our common home. And as we know, in drafting Laudato Si, Pope Francis was advised by an expert group of scientists, and most of them members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. I know some of them, and some of them are Nobel laureates, the best scientists in the field right now in their own disciplines. And so allow me to quote the scientific paper, which came out in 2009, well before Laudato Si, which was updated in 2015. And the study, some of you might be familiar with it, I'm sure, is entitled Planetary Boundaries. So what the scientists did, they put together, they concentrated on 9 areas, beginning with the climate change, but also ocean acidification, the nitrogen cycle, and many areas. And the center, they said, is a green zone. And the green, as we know, is the color associated with safety. So as long as we can remain in the green zone, we are safe. But the moment we move into red, it is dangerous. And already in 2009, scientists told us that in 3 areas, climate, with regard to biodiversity loss and nitrogen cycle due to modern agriculture, we have gone beyond the safety zone. And the study updated in 2015 also added land system change. So imagine in 4 areas, we are already in a very critical moment, a critical phase. And people might ask me or ask us, what's the problem if species go into extinction, the biodiversity loss? I usually tell my students when I speak about biodiversity loss, I quote the words of Albert Einstein, who said that if the honeybees were to go into extinction in 5 or 6 years, the entire humanity will be wiped out. We depend on honeybees and other insects for impollination, for example, which is fundamental for agriculture. So we need other species. And that's the way God has designed. It is an intricate web of life. And so this web of life is now cracking, it's being disintegrated. And another study is, again, most of you will be familiar with it, the way we consume our home planet's resources. And this can be measured scientifically, very empirically. If you were to go on Google and put ecological footprint analysis, you can also measure your own footprint of your community. And these studies tells us that if we go on like this, because we are consuming too much of our planet's finite resources, that within a decade, we will require another planet altogether. And the sad thing there is, it's the huge disparity in the way we consume our resources. If all of us were to live like those in Australia, we would require something like every 2 months we would require a planet. So 6 planets a year. The US is 5, and Europe is much like around half. And the planet still hurts because the poor people don't consume. But that is not it's not the right thing to do. It's like we are depriving other people of our resources. And as he said, Earth is our common home. We live in it as a common family. And in a family, all of us have equal access to the resources of the family. That's how a family is built. That's what a family is. But as humanity, we are not one family. And climate change, and now Pope Francis hardly uses the word climate change. In his speeches, he uses the word climate crisis or climate emergency. Allow me to dwell on this. Why Pope Francis uses the word climate crisis? Because it is a crisis. 2015, the same year, Laudato Si was published. The SDGs, UN Sustainable Development Goals were announced. And also the Paris Climate Agreement came about. That was in December. Laudato Si was in May, signed in May, but published in June. And in the Paris Agreement, the central tenet or the central focus is on limiting average global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and possibly 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, after that, in 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a very important study on 1.5 degrees centigrade. And they told us that 1.5 degrees centigrade is crucial, it's almost non-negotiable. Why? Now, this is a graph of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you have the temperature rise of the planet, average global temperature rise of the last 1,000 years, imagine. And you see the temperature rises and falls and rises and falls. But you see what is awaiting us by the end of this century, 2100. We are walking into a totally unprecedented situation. Now, Earth was never warm as it would be if we carry on as with the business as usual. Now, scientists can go back to nearly 800,000 years, or almost a million years, and calculate the global average temperature of that time. Now, we know the last 11,000 years, Earth's average temperature hardly varied by 1 degree. So imagine last 11,000 years, 1 degree. Rather, from 1850, that's from the beginning of the modern industrial revolution, to today, Earth has warmed by, say, 1.1 degrees centigrade. And we are seeing the impacts, We feel so close to you for the wildfires, that you are still going through. And not the first time, year after year. The same thing happened in Australia. We have had floods and hurricanes. And that's all the consequence of 1.1 degrees centigrade rise in global average temperature. And scientists are telling us, if you go beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, the Greenland can start, it's already melting, but that will be irreversible, and so many other consequences. That's the reason that Pope Francis, in his message for the season of creation, even this year, 1st of September, he said that we should do everything possible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And he invited those going to take part in the next climate summit, COP26 in Glasgow, to do everything possible. So this just to put things in perspective, why the climate crisis is so urgent. And again, it's not again just climate crisis. It's also the problem with plastic pollution. Scientists tell us that by 2050, we will have more plastic than fish in our oceans in terms of weight. And we are seeing it around the world. There's so much of plastic pollution, water scarcity. I always feel moved when I present the slide. This is about Africa, and Pope Francis mentions Africa. This must be Sudan, where they tell us, people have to walk literally something like 7 kilometers to find water. For us, we, just open the tap and water flows. But for most people, for many people, it's not the case. And imagine women, children, and especially girls having to walk 7 kilometers, and which means you have to return 7 kilometers and carrying that water on your back or on your head, and the health, problems that can be generated. And water is, as we know, is a huge problem. And biodiversity extinction. So, it's all these. So, and Laudato Si offers us a comprehensive view of all these crises put together. And allow me to conclude this section with a slide on what scientists call the tipping points. And this is even more urgent today, relevant today than, say, it was in 2015, that we are reaching crucial tipping points. The Greenland ice sheet on the top, for example. Arctic is melting. And we know that the Greenland alone can raise sea levels by something like 7 meters. Now that is frightening. And allow me to make the connection here with the 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, scientists tell us that now this Greenland is, unfortunately, has already begun to melt, but then that can carry on. Now, if we are to remain at 1.5 degrees centigrade, that melting will take place between 1,000 and 10,000 years, over thousands of years. So we have time to adapt to some extent. Now, if you are to cross 2 degrees centigrade, that melting can take place in centuries, in less than 1,000 years. And even with the Paris Agreement, as we know, we are working towards 3.6 degrees of global average temperature rise. So by the end of the century, scientists expect something like 1 meter sea level rise. And they might think of places like Bangladesh or our own coast. So the Greenland, we know the Amazon is dying out. It's already deforested by 25%. And early we thought, scientists told us that if you go beyond 40%, the entire Amazon, and Amazon is crucial for the entire planetary system of the planet, and for many other reasons, the entire Amazon can die out. But I remember Professor John Schellenhuber of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences told at the Amazon Synod that even if you reach 30%, that's another 5%, Amazon is in danger. The West African monsoon, we have the locusts, returning year after year, the Indian summer monsoon, and also the West Antarctic, an ice sheet, and I will come back to towards the end of my presentation, and the coral reefs in Australia. So we are literally reaching critical tipping points. So it is the cry of the earth. And the third reason why Laudato Si's vision is integral, because it connects the cry of the earth with the cry of the poor. That's Laudato Si, paragraph 49. Both everyday experience and scientific research show that the gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. That's the reason Pope Francis himself repeats that Laudato Si is a social encyclical. And I remember coming across one study where the author pointed out that climate is important, but it's mentioned just 14 times in the text, while the word poor is mentioned 59 times. So we know at the heart of the encyclical, there is this attention for the cry of the poor, because the ecological crisis is already affecting food security when you have droughts like this in Africa or India or elsewhere. It's affecting health. This is Bangladesh. Imagine, they tell me that in Bangladesh, when floods come, water remains something like 3 to 4 months there. And imagine people living in those homes. I always think it's not just our common home. Also the homes of our brothers and sisters in many parts of the world. You have had the wildfires, the floods, and it's our own homes that are being threatened and already being threatened. And shelter. So, the ecological crisis is not an abstract problem. It affects food security, it affects our health, and it affects our shelter. These are, people in the Pacific, the small island states. I said the Greenland is melting and the sea levels are rising, and some islands are only submerged. And within a few decades, some of them will just disappear. And where can these people go? The same thing in Africa. We talk so much about migration, and some politicians think it's enough to build walls or to close the ports that problem will be solved. It is a very complex problem. If people are migrating, it's also very much due to, I remember last year we made a study, out of 28 million people who are refugees, 18 million are refugees due to natural disasters, droughts and floods. So these are very huge problems. And here again, it's a question of eco-justice. Now, this is a very recent study, just came out last month, on 21st of September. And this study said that the richest 10% of humanity, they account for something like 52% of the cumulative emissions. And the richest 1% contributes something like 15%. One person alone contributing like 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The middle class, 40% contributing something like 41%. Now, and this is saddest thing, the poorest 50%, the other half of humanity, they just contribute 7% of the cumulative emissions. Maybe we can just contrast, what we mentioned about the richest 1% contributing 15%, and the other half of humanity, over 3 billion people, contributing not even half of that. Their total contribution is 7%. Now, is it not a question of justice? Because we are living in what we say a divided world. This is a study from the journal for doctors, Lancet, medical journal, and it was about people dying due to climate crisis. And on the top of the slide, we have the map of the world in terms of emissions, who are emitting most, and down we have the map of the world in terms of people suffering the impacts. So you see the US is so conspicuously evident on the top, also Europe, India, China, India probably also in terms of population. Africa, you don't see it on the top part. And look at the down part of the slide. Africa is so conspicuously evident. So it's again, this is what Desmond Tutu called the climate apartheid. Earth is one home, but we don't live in it as one family. As Pope Francis recently reminded us also in the very powerful encyclical Fratelli Tutti, that we need to be brothers and sisters, but unfortunately, as the first chapter of the encyclical points out, we are not living as a common family in a common home. And that's the reason Laudato Si, Pope Francis tells us that today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And Pope Francis decries the fact that on the global arena, the poor are forgotten. There's little in the way of clear awareness of problems which especially affect the excluded. The poor are conveniently forgotten or ignored at the high table of world affairs. Yet, as the Pope points out, they are the majority of the planet's population, billions of people. So, and the pandemic we are living through highlighted this cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. The pandemic, as we know, COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. It has resulted on account of deforestation, of degradation of ecosystems, wildlife trading, that we have abused nature and the planet is not healthy, we cannot be healthy. And we have had, SARS and Ebola and many others. And COVID-19 is, of course, the latest with such a very huge impact. And again, who are paying the price? This is another slide which moves me, because this is what happened in India. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the Prime Minister comes on the television and says, we are going for a lockdown. And from midnight, the entire country will be under lockdown. Imagine, thousands and thousands of, hundreds of thousands of labor, migrant laborers and who are in the cities. And nothing was, they had to literally walk back, with all their provisions, with their children, back to their villages. And we saw, as with the ecological crisis, the pandemic has shown that, all these problems, the ones who pay the price are the poor, the highest price, of course. And the fourth element is that Laudato Si, we said, earth as our common home, the cry of the earth, the cry of the poor. But Laudato Si, in the second chapter, offers us a theological vision, because Pope Francis tells us that faith convictions can offer Christians and some other believers as well ample motivation to care for nature and for the most vulnerable of their brothers and sisters. Because we realize that it is not just a physical problem, it is not just a moral problem, It's also a theological problem because from the lens of faith, from the perspective of faith, creation, as we know, is God's first and primordial revelation. As the fathers of the church used to say, God has written two books. And the first book is creation. Pope Francis writes, God has written a precious book whose letters are the multitude of created things present in the universe. And creation is indeed the very first revelation, epiphany of God. And if you go back to Genesis, to why Christians, why Catholics should be concerned about creation care, well, that's the very first commandment that we find in the Bible given to humanity, Genesis 2:15. After Adam and Eve are created, they are asked to take care of this garden, cultivate it, and care for it, and keep it. And this is our vocation. This is what we might call is the very first commandment, given to humanity. I love to call it, it's our job description in the Bible, to be stewards of God's creation. So caring for creation is inextricably linked to our Christian vocation, our identity. It's something, a mission that God has entrusted to us. The beautiful image of the Genesis. And also because, allow me to stress this, it's a theological problem. It's a spiritual problem. And Laudato Si begins, right in paragraph 2, Pope Francis tells us that the violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. So if there's disharmony outside, it's just a reflection of the disharmony within. And the very wise words of Pope Benedict in 2005. I remember listening to the homily in 2005. They were so happy when Pope Francis quoted him in Laudato Si. Pope Benedict, in his first homily in his inaugural Mass as Pope, he said that the external deserts are expanding because the internal deserts have become so vast. What a beautiful intuition that it is, ultimately a spiritual crisis. So this is the reason why Laudato Si is a vision is integral. It offers a physical perspective, a moral perspective, and a theological perspective. And again, the quotation I began with, that human life is grounded in these three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships with God, with our neighbor, and with earth itself. And Laudato Si tells us that according to the Bible, these three vital relationships have been broken, both outwardly and within us. This rupture is sin. This is what we call. So when we cause climate crisis, when the poor suffer, it is a sin. And we really need to widen the horizon of sin. And Pope Francis, the chapter on integral ecology, concludes it, proposing St. Francis as the model of integral ecology. You are in San Francisco. And, St. Francis' conversion was to God, was to Mother Earth, but that conversion concludes the day not concludes, but really begins the day he embraced that poor leper in the outskirts of Assisi. And this is the integral ecological vision, a conversion to God, a conversion to our common hill, and a conversion especially to the most vulnerable amongst us. And Pope Francis in Laudato Si tells us that we need to recognize the deeper roots of the crisis. It would be, now the last 3 points are very simple, so I can go faster. It would hardly be helpful to describe the symptoms without acknowledging the human origins of the ecological crisis. Because, this is the third chapter of the encyclical, where Pope Francis tells us that we need to unearth the underlying conceptual foundations of the reigning dominant technocratic paradigm. And he points out two roots. One is modern anthropocentrism, and the other is the mechanistic vision of the natural world. And one author he quotes a number of times is Romano Guardini. Now, it is the fruit of modern anthropocentrism, because we think we are the center of the world. We are not the center. God alone is the center. So from modernity onwards, we live in total, we think we can live in total independence, and we think we live under this illusion that we are the center, that we are the one and only point of reference, and everything becomes relative. We are the ones who decide what reality should be. And then we have, as a consequence, a distorted view of the relationship between humanity and the natural world. And we think we can master the world. So this is modern anthropocentrism. And the way we look at ourselves, but how do we look at the natural world? And this is what Pope Francis calls a mechanistic conception of the natural world. Earth is just a storehouse of resources to use and throw. We have a secular, disenchanted view of the natural world. Genesis 1:2 says that the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. The book of wisdom says, your spirit is in all things. God's spirit is there. But from modernity onwards, we think, earth is just there in nature. It doesn't have any more God's presence. And therefore, we have desacralized nature. And that has aided the modern economy. And the infinite economic growth, because everything is things, things to use and throw. And we can have mastery over everything. So that is the roots of the problem. Now I come towards the end of my presentation. We need an integral response. And allow me to, in the context of the ecological crisis, ensuring the habitability of our common planetary home becomes the most important of all common goods, as it is a necessary precondition for the fulfillment of the rest. So I'm going to stress here on politics. Politics should be about polis, about the welfare of the city and of the common hill. And because politics' primary vocation is to serve the common good. A politics, tells Pope Francis in Laudato Si, concerned with immediate results, supported by consumer sectors, and just think of the lobbies in Washington or Brussels or in all our capitals, is driven to produce short-term growth. The myopia of power politics delays the inclusion of a far-sighted, because politicians think of next 4 or 5 years how to come back to power, whereas we need, Pope Francis says, a far-sighted environmental agenda. And the economy, oikos nomos, it's not about making money, it's part of it. But economy's real vocation is to manage, is oikos nomos, to manage care for our common hill. And today that's not happening. People just think of money and GDP and economic growth, and the planet suffers. We are priests. The true oikonomia reflects the Eucharistic vocation of human communities. Eucharist is sharing, namely to share the gifts of creation with all the members of our common. We have one home, one family, so we share. And that is koinonia, communion. Like the one bread broken and shared at the table of that's Eucharist that we celebrate, one bread broken and shared with everyone. And earth is indeed humankind's common table, laid by God for all. Around that table we gather in a spirit of conviviality, not in competitive scramble, but in joyful fellowship and beautiful words, nurturing and sheltering one another. And we are not living this Eucharist. The words of Samuel Ryan, an Indian theologian, comes to my mind. Once he wrote that, without bread we cannot celebrate the Eucharist. And priests, we know that, sacramentally we need bread for the Eucharist. Then the Samuel Ryan added, without bread and without bread for all, can we truly celebrate the Eucharist? I think it's a very, very deep question. When 821 million of our people go to bed without having had even one meal, and studies say that COVID-19 is going to add at least 100 million more people, is going to push at least 100 million people into abject poverty. When our brothers and sisters go hungry, can we truly celebrate the Eucharist. And the last point, the response is also educational, but not in a narrow sense. Education is an overall integral response. Pope Francis tells us that many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. A great cultural, educational, spiritual and educational challenge stands before us. And it will demand that we set out on the path of long renewal. It struck me in Laudato Si, Francis is also very concrete. He says like simple things like avoiding the use of plastic and paper, reducing water consumption, separating refuse and using public transport, planting trees, and all these things help. Small things do help, as Mother Teresa of Calcutta used to say. It's from small things that we begin. And what children are telling us, this integral vision of children, that Earth is our Mother Earth. In that womb, all of us are there, but in harmony with the rest of God's creation. And children are teaching us, with small little things we can begin. Allow me to spend a few moments on the urgency of action, and it's an integral vision for action. This urgency, scientists tell us that we have something like a decade, literally a decade to turn things around. This is, we spoke about the 1.5 degree. In 1972, Earth had warmed something like 0.2 degrees centigrade. Today, it's from industrial times. Today, it's a 1.1 degrees centigrade, and we are seeing the impacts. And by the end of the century, we are walking towards something like 3.5 degrees centigrade. And this is a study which came out in the issue of Nature. It's on the cover page of Nature, as we know, the most important scientific journal. And it really, worried me. It was about the West Antarctic ice sheet. I remember as a student 25, 30 years ago, we thought Antarctic is stable because there's ice on the southern pole for nearly 34 million years. So we thought Antarctic is solid. And scientists are telling us, no, even the Antarctic is becoming unstable, especially the West Antarctic ice sheet. And if Antarctic were also to melt, I'm afraid we will really lose control of things. Things can really get out of hand. All that to show that it's an urgency. And Laudato Si has these words of Pope Francis that come straight into our hearts. He says, what kind of world do we want to leave to those who come after us, to children who are now growing up? If with business as usual, global average temperatures can reach beyond 3 degrees by the end of the century, and what are the impacts we are going to have? And that's the world that we are going to leave to our children. So it is a moral responsibility on our part. And children are telling us, it's not that, and they are descended on our streets, climate strikes, and especially children telling us, don't mess with my future, that we have no right to mess with their future. They're our children. And that's the reason I conclude with that Pope Francis, for the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si, proclaimed a special anniversary. It has never happened with any encyclical. We wait for 30, 40, 50 years to celebrate, or 100 years for the anniversary. Hardly after 5 years, Pope Francis, because he realized, and the church realizes, that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor has become so urgent. Laudato Si year has so many initiatives, but the Laudato Si year will end with the launch of a Laudato Si action platform, a multi-year rollout plan to make communities around the world totally sustainable in the spirit of the integral ecology of Laudato Si. So the plan is this, we are using the 7-year, because this year for the season of creation, the theme was Jubilee. So Jubilee is like, 7 years. So it's like, we would like to invite people to begin from, bottom up, a 7-year journey, beginning with our families, our communities, our parishes, our dioceses, basic Christian communities. We thought of basic ecological communities, so cities or villages, our educational institutions, schools, universities, and others, our hospitals, our healthcare centers, our businesses, our farms, our trade unions, and the rest of all the other organizations, NGOs, foundations, communication centers, and everyone, and religious orders. And we are already working on it. People are coming forward. And the idea is, when we will celebrate the 6th anniversary of Laudato Si on 24th of May, 2021, when the Laudato Si year will conclude, we wish to launch this 7-year plan. And we are going to invite people to join, families, community, in all these groups. And with a criteria, with a criterion. And the criteria we are proposing is, we played on SDGs, and we thought of LSGs, Laudato Si goals, 7 of them. This was done with the help of young people from the Philippines. And these are the 7 goals that will respond to the cry of the earth. So all the physical part, energy, water, biodiversity, waste, plastic, all the physical part of it. That we respond to the cry of the poor, that we are open to indigenous communities, migrants, human trafficking, all that. That we work on economics, where we invest our money, the choices we make, that we change our lifestyles, each one at the micro level, and the 2 pillars of education and spirituality. Spirituality, for example, in our catechesis, in our preaching, in our theology, we keep Laudato Si in mind. And the 7th one, that we do all this together as a community. So this is a journey, and I'm closing my presentation. And the plan, the dream is 2021, we begin with the first groups, and we already have leaders. Allow me to go back to the previous slide. Like for families, we have the Focolare and many other organizations leading it. For communities, we have asked the Caritas with the Bishops' Conference around the world to lead it. Education institutions, schools, we have the Salesians of Don Bosco, scholars, occurrentes, and many others leading that. Universities, we have the Jesuits, and then the Federation of Catholic Universities and others helping us. For hospitals, we have, the Chai in India, Mercy Sisters, and many others helping us. Businesses, we have the Economy of Francesco, 3,000 young economists helping us, like that in each of the areas. And for religious orders, the Conference of Religious Orders, for men and women in Rome, they're helping us. So the idea is 2020, when the first group will begin. And in 2022, we hope the next group can begin. And hopefully the double of the number of this, because we want to create a critical mass. And allow me to say a word on the critical mass. They say any transformation begins when there is a critical mass. And the critical mass is not a very big number. It's just 3.5% of a group. So we hope, because we literally have a decade. So in a few years, we can create the critical mass. But sociologists tell us that for systemic change, we need something like 21 to 25%. So that's the reason we are working. We would like to work with other churches. It's an ecumenical journey. We would like to work with other religions. We would like to work with the civil society, the United Nations, and all people of goodwill, because Earth is our common home, and we live in it as a common family. And I conclude with this image from the latest encyclical of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti. We think it's time to kneel gently on Mother Earth, and kneel gently and bandage the wounds of our suffering brothers and sisters. And when we do that, we will inherit eternal life. We will be with God. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. And we hope that the Archdiocese of San Francisco will become a Laudato Si Archdiocese, that all your institutions, all your families, all can join this 7-year journey. And we are aware at the Vatican that you are already leaders in this area. So please continue to lead for the rest of the US Church, for the rest of the Universal Church, and for the entire world. Thank you so very much for listening to me, and God bless you.